So this is the second video of 6.1. So 6.1, B as in boy, what we're going to do is we're going to change decimals to percentages. So when we have a decimal like 0.27, in order to change that to back to a percent or to a percent, we move the decimal 2 places that way, to the right. So we have 27%. So we can go back and forth pretty easily, percentage to decimals, decimals to percentages. So we want to change it back, we move 2 points to the left away from the decimal or percentage sign, and we take it off. So pretty easy to do that. So remember when I said that percentage means, well, let's see what it says, per 100. It's a way of comparing a number to 100. So if we had something like 4.89 and I wanted to change that to a percent, I'm just going to move that decimal place over 2 points. So I have 489%. So 489, that number is a lot bigger than 100. But again, we're comparing it to 100. It's not necessarily out of 100. So 489% means that compared to 100, we have 489. So that's a lot more than 100. So if we had 1.23, changing that to percent would be 123%. So again, we're comparing it to 100. So we are looking at 123. So we're 23 bigger than 100. So we've got a bigger increase. So if we had something like 0.09 and we wanted to change that to a percent, it would be 9%, because we're going to move that decimal place over 2 and it's going to be right there. So if you're looking at somebody's batting average, so you're watching baseball and you find out that their batting average is .357, okay, and if you were to change that to a decimal, or I'm sorry, to a percent, we'd move our decimal place over 2 and they have a 35.7% batting average. That means they hit 35.7 pitches out of every 100. So it kind of gives you an idea that when they have a batting average written as a decimal, you can change it by moving the decimal place over 2 to find out the percentage of balls they hit out of 100. So now what we're going to do is we're going to change our percents to fractions. Alright, so we changed decimals to percent. Now let's change our percents to fractions. And changing them to fractions is not really difficult, but it can have a little bit more division. So let's say that we were to change 4.5%. Let me write that on here, 4.5%. And the question, which this one is example number 8, they want to change it to a fraction. So what we're going to do, always put it over 100, and you're just taking this number and putting it over 100. So this is where I do it a little bit different than what the book says. What I do, in order to change this, or in order to change this to a fraction in lowest terms, we have our fraction here, but we never like to have a decimal in a fraction. So it's not really to lowest terms. So what I do is I count how many zeros are to the right, or how many numbers are to the right of my decimal. In this case there's 1. And what I do then is I move the decimal over 1 and I add 1 0 to the bottom. So if you move this decimal here over to the right, you add that many zeros to the bottom. So we're only moving it 1 point over to the right. So we're going to put that decimal here and then I add a 0 here. So actually what I have there then is 45 over 1,000. Okay, you can look and see how the book does it, and if you want to do it a different way, that's fine according to the book. And then we just reduce. 9 goes into 45, or 5 goes into 45 9 times, and 5 goes into 1,000 200 times, and that ends up being reduced. And we've already done reducing, so you're good with that. Example number 9, they give you 32.5%, and they're asking you to change that to a fraction in lowest terms. Well, what I do with that is I change it right away to 32.5 over 100, and I'm going to take the percentage off, because when I put it over 100 I can take my percentage sign off because now it's a fraction. And again, I'm going to move my decimal over 1 to get rid of it, so it becomes 325. But when I do that, I have to add that extra 0 on there. So if I were to move my decimal point 1, that becomes, I add 1 0 to the bottom. If I moved it over 2, that means I'd add 2 zeros to the bottom, etc. So that gives me 325 over 1,000. I do my factor tree and get my prime numbers and cancel, and I reduce that then to 13 over 40. So any fraction in the whole history of the universe can be written as a decimal, and any decimal can be written as a fraction, and any percentage can be written as a fraction or a decimal. So this next part here, we're going to go ahead and change fractions to percentages. So if I have a fraction such as 3/8, and I want to change that to a percentage, what percentage, if I know that 3/8 of all the people in Alaska fish, but I want to know the percentage, because that's what I can get my head around. 3/8 doesn't really tell me a whole lot, but if I knew that it was 38%, that would help me to be able to visualize that better. So 3/8, changing it to a fraction, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change first of all to a decimal. So I'm going to go 3 out of 8. So I'm going to divide here. 3 divided by 8. And I'm going to do all the division, which I'm not going to do right now, but I get 0.375. So that's changing my fraction to a decimal, which you've already had experience doing. Now changing it to a percent. I'm going to take this decimal and move it over 2 and add the percent sign. That's all I do. Once I have it in a decimal, it's real easy to change it to a percent, because I just move the decimal 2 places to the right and put the percent sign on, and I'm done. So in example 12, let's say that I want to change 5 over 12 to a percent. So again, I do my division. So my 12 goes into 5, and I do my long division here, and I get 0.41666. This just goes on forever and ever. So that's actually, when I write it as a decimal, 0.416, and I'll put a line over my 6 there to show that that goes on forever. And usually what I do when this goes on forever, I actually will round. So 0.41666, and I just round to 3 decimal places, normally dealing with percentages. And we'll just round the 6 to a 7, because I look at the number right here and see that it's 5 or bigger. So this number right here will raise to a 7. So we'll just write that as 0.417. Alright, so that's the hard part. The easy part is changing it from that percentage then to a decimal. And all I do is move my decimal place over, again, 2 places, and add the percent sign. So I have 41.7%. And we're good there. Alright, last one is example 13, and we're asked to change 2 1/2 to a percent. So, a crummy percent sign. Alright, so we're going to change 2 1/2 to 2.5. So now we're already in decimal, because you can't change a fraction to a percent without first changing that fraction to a decimal. So this was easy, to change 2 1/2 to 2.5. And in order to change this to a percent, I have to move the decimal place over 2 places. 1, 2. Whenever I move the decimal, and I don't have enough places to move it, like in this one I wanted to move it over 2, but there's only one number here that I can move it over past, you just add a 0. So I move the decimal place over 2, and I'm at 250%. So compared to 100, I have 250. So I have 2.5 or 2.5 times bigger than 100. And that's okay. You can have percentages that are higher than 100%. And if you look at the table number 1 in the blue box, it gives you the fraction, or some common fractions, common decimals, and common percentages. Just so it's real easy for you to look at 2/5, realize that the decimal of 2/5 is 0.4, which is 40%. So there's some common ones there for you to look at. And that's it for lesson 6.1.